Hello, and welcome back to PolyToots. Yep, no, almost forgot my name. Yeah, we're going to be doing the retopo in this video, but I have just noticed that I have some issues with my symmetry for my sculpt. Oh, and I have also moved that inside piece outside. It'll just make it easier to retopo. But anyway, for the symmetry problems, which I'm just going to press like H on some objects that I think are a bit of a problem. And I'm just going to make sure that symmetry is enabled on them, and then I'm going to press that button down there to actually just like flip the symmetry. And again, like if it flips the wrong side, you need to go and perform an action like pressing shift and clicking just to let 3D Coat know which side it is you want to copy. But either way, the end goal here is just to kind of have something that is actually symmetrical, because otherwise we might run into some problems when it comes to the retopo. We can always clean this up afterwards anyway, so it's not like a super priority, but you know, if you see a problem, then you should fix a problem. So yeah. Now over to the retopo room, and we're just going to get rid of that mesh that we had before, which we used to help cut out some of our shapes in the sculpt. And I'm just going to isolate the base shape here, and this shape does have some extra pieces with it, like the bits and these other corner things. I'm not entirely sure what it is that I named them, but we don't actually need to include these in the retopo, by which I mean we don't need to create this sort of unique geometry for them, because we can just create the retopo of the base shape itself, and then when it comes to the bake, we'll just sort of include those details within the boundaries. But you know, that's something that we'll get to later. So yeah, for now I am just enabling the symmetry on the X and the Z, and I'm using the points and faces tool here, which is by far my favorite tool to use. You just left click to place points, and then once a quad or even a triangle can be made, you could just right click to create it. It also has some additional features that we'll cover in a bit. For here, I'm just selecting an edge, and I'm using the transform tool to extrude them, and you can do that by pressing that apply button. So each time you press apply, it creates a new piece of geometry. Just make sure you then move it out. There is some weird stuff happening here with the gizmo, and it kind of just gets offset from where the actual selection is. I'm not sure what's going on here. I think it's something to do with symmetry. It seems like a bit of a bug to me, but it's not something that can completely stop me from moving forward. So I can just keep hitting that apply button and moving the faces sort of roughly where I need them. Now I am just going to stop that before I reach the center, and then I'll just switch back to points and faces and just weld those up. And this is a bit of a tricky tool, like make sure that you actually have welded the pieces together, because sometimes it looks like you have but you haven't, and that can cause a lot of issues later. So I tend to just try to move them around afterwards just to see if they have actually welded or not. And now just using the select tool, again with the edges, I just select one edge and press the L key just to create a loop. And I'm going into the transform tool, and I'm using that same method as we did before with the apply, just to create like this extra edge here, just like a bit of a lip, and then you can just like scale it in on the top a bit, just so it, you know, it creates that lip. And then we just do the exact same thing for the underneath as well. Now I'm just adding in some more geometry on the top here, again with the points and faces tool. And I realized that I don't really like the base topology that I have happening here already, so I do just remove an edge here and just add another one in slightly to the left, so it's a bit more kind of uniform. And the way that I'm adding this in is with the points and faces tool. It has an option, if you hold down Control, you can see here, you can just basically add in a loop wherever you want, which is pretty cool. And then also on the sides, there's just one more edge than I would like, so I do get rid of that. But then I do have a bit of a spacing issue, so using the middle mouse button or whatever it is set to on your Wacom pen, other brands are available, you can just reposition the points so that there is a sort of more uniform spread. And this is likely to cause a bit of wibbly wobbliness in your mesh, which is why I quite like this method of just like afterwards you select an edge loop and then just go to the transform tool, and you can actually just use the scale just to bring like all of those edge loops that you have selected to a straight point. Now with the symmetry enabled again, I'm just going to add in the geometry here with the points and faces tool. And this is another example of where I'm going to hold down the Control key just to create like this edge loop here, which will just sort of be this nice little lip. And if you didn't know, if you hold down shift with the points and faces tool, you can actually force it to use a triangle, which is pretty cool because oftentimes it just wants to default to a quad. Just a little bit of troubleshooting here, but if you're doing stuff like if you have the edges selected and you're scaling, but you're getting these weird results like you see here, it's probably because you have symmetry enabled. Again, this kind of just seems like a bit of a bug, but if you are encountering this, just turn off the symmetry and everything will be golden. And yep, lastly, just to finish off this shape, points and faces again on the bottom, and we'll just fill in the blanks basically. So now we're done with that, we'll move on to the feet next. So I'm just going to isolate those, and then we'll make a new retopo layer, call it feet. And at this point, it's probably worth mentioning, I am going to keep the same names as the parent layers of the sculpt, because when it comes to doing the baking, we are going to be using name correspondence, but don't worry if that just makes no sense whatsoever. So yeah, I am just using the points and faces tool again, because as I say, I do absolutely love it. There is a point here, which the quads tool probably would have been a good one to use, but again, I just love using the points and faces tool so much that even if it's not the best tool for the job, I'll still use it. And so what I do for here, because it's not quite connecting up a quad shape, I will just create my own quad from it and then just move and weld the points as I need to. And the only other thing to mention here is after a certain point, the symmetry just somehow became broken. Now ordinarily you can just hit the symmetrical copy button to fix this, but much like with the sculpt, 3D Coat will pick a side, basically, like whichever side it wants to, and it doesn't seem to follow the same logic in that it's the last side you worked on. So to fix it in here, it's a bit kind of weird in that at first I had to disable one axis of my symmetry, and then you can use the invert mirror option to make sure that your symmetry does actually apply correctly. And if it doesn't, you can always hit Ctrl Z, because basically we're ruling it down to a 50-50, like it will either work or it won't. So if it won't work, hit Ctrl Z. If it will work, then you're good to go to move on to the next step, which is to then add in the next symmetry level just by enabling the symmetry plane that you want. And then again, you do the exact same thing. You just perform the symmetry. If it works, great. If it doesn't, then just undo. But yeah, it's a bit weird. This is actually the first time I've encountered this. Maybe there's a better solution, but this is the only thing that I could think of, really. So now you can see that we have moved on to the next piece, which is the lid. And I'm going to also unhide two other pieces here, which I want to kind of include in the retopo. So, you know, I'm not going to do like the lid piece on its own as a retopo and then model in the front plate and then those other cover things. Like I plan to treat it all kind of as one object, although I've just noticed that I hid the cover plates there, so I guess I didn't do that. I only modeled this today. What a memory. So yeah, I am just going to speed through this mostly because it is just, again, like the points and faces tool. The only major thing to kind of watch out for is I am working with symmetry on the X and the Z, because for the most part for this shape that does kind of make sense, but also I need to stop saying kind of. There's that one commenter who pointed out that I say it, and now I can't help but notice every time I say it. But anyway, yeah, for the most part, symmetry on the X and the Z for this shape is very beneficial, but there is a section here at the front which I want to be different. So you'll notice here that I have to disable the symmetry on the Z. I might as well still keep it for the X. You know, there's no point in actually completely disregarding the symmetry. And for this particular shape, I do kind of come back, and again, I've said kind of, sorry about that. I do reach another point where it makes sense to enable the symmetry on the X and the Z for certain portions, but make sure that you do turn off the symmetry when you don't need it. And it's not the end of the world if you do, like, keep it on or leave it off. All of this is fixable. I'm just mentioning it because, you know, it's always best to do things right, but we are only human. You know how I was saying that you can use the control key with the points and faces tool to insert a loop? Well, you can also hold the control and shift key here to just add in edges. This is the default behavior, but you can change it up in the top menu to do other functions. And you know how before I was talking about that moving the line selection with symmetry on, and it kind of just gets all weird. I do think that it is for sure related to the symmetry, because you can see here when my cursor kind of goes over the point, it goes weird. So if I use the other axis to move it, then things are kind of more correct. So yeah, it definitely seems to be a bit of a bug on 3D Coat's end. But then yeah, after that I'm just again using the points and faces tool just to use the middle mouse button and welding up all these points. I do decide to weld up this point here and then just create like an extra bit of a triangle here. And it's always good to kind of create your own triangles in situations like this. Otherwise, when it comes to exporting, 3D Coat will kind of choose the triangulation that it wants, and it might end up choosing something that is kind of wrong. We might talk more about that later when it comes to sort of the baking, but you'll have to forgive me if I forget. And this is one of those scenarios where I realized I probably should have been working with the symmetry on the X and the Z. So I just apply the symmetry copy now, but then you'll see that I also get the mesh from the other side that I don't want. So I just select that and remove it, and then just basically back to the points and faces tool again and just fill in the bits that I need to. And from here on out, it's kind of more of the same, really, just mostly, I think all actually, the points and faces tool, just adding in the points that I need to, and just filling in these gaps that are left, making sure that my topology is, you know, at least somewhat clean. And now here, I noticed a bit of a major issue actually. My sculpt seems to be at a bit of an angle, and I guess this is because I was using the control key to open and close it whilst we were sculpting it, and I must have just like slipped from the control key, so I've left it at a bit of an angle. You can see there compared to the base, it's you know, pretty slanted. So I'm just unhiding all of the pieces that are in that layer. And what you can do is actually select the conform to retopo mesh button up in the top menu, and we're basically just going to rotate this mesh roughly, you know, to the eye so that it's straight, and it will try its best to keep the retopology mesh moving with it. This works great for sort of minor changes, but don't rely on this for kind of like massive changes, because oftentimes the retopo mesh can get really messed up. And so back to the same old procedure, just the points and faces tool. I'll try my best to include some other tools. I do lean heavily on the points and faces because it is just amazing. But yeah, just gonna finish off this shape, you know, holding shift to insert some triangles wherever I need to. I am including like this middle loop here. It's not really essential because this is a flat piece of geometry, but it does keep my topology pretty clean, and clean topology is usually pretty helpful when it comes to like the bakes, and also like later on if you think about like how light will cast on this from in-game. But I mean, that's a topic for another time, I think. Now we're going to work on the bolts, but this is a child of the lid parent layer. And so I want to show you a bit of a problem with trying to retopo objects that are children of a parent layer, especially with something like the points and faces tool. So you can see here that obviously it's going to raycast to the nearest thing that it sees. And so one thing we can do, which works for this but not for all scenarios, is to press that little icon there. So we're going to turn that lid into basically a ghost object. And now when we use the points and faces tool, it will actually go through it. But as I say, this doesn't work in all scenarios. I think especially with the strokes tool, which we'll talk about a bit later. But yeah, for now, I did promise that I would use a different tool here, so I might as well just go with the quads tool. And up here in the top, you can choose the extrusion method. They all do slightly different things, and I've just gone with parallel for this. As an aside, and also just to make sure that I don't end up repeating myself too much later, I'm not renaming this layer, so it's staying, you know, as it is. And that's because we're going to eventually merge it into other layers afterwards. And I'll be doing this quite a lot, so just letting you know. So now that same trick as we did before, where we can select some edges by selecting one and pressing the L key, and then using the transform tool to scale it, to straighten it out. And then if you hit the apply button, that will actually do an extrusion, and then you can, you know, scale up other things, so you can create, you know, nice little lips around edges or whatever, really. And I'm going to do the same for the bottom, but the bottom is sort of less important, so I'm not going to give it an extra lip. I'm just going to use the transform to straighten it out and to move it down. It's also worth noting that later on we actually remove the underside of this geometry, so this particular part of the video is it's a bit redundant actually. You can see here that when we've added in this point, it has actually snapped it down to the inside of that screw, which is fine for now. What we're actually going to do is, if you remember, with the points and faces tool, we can use the control and shift key to insert our own triangles. And so I'm just going to do that here. So this will allow me to actually have just this extra vert. And so now I can select the vert that's inside this screw, and using the transform tool, just move it up a bit, which might look a little strange, but after we do the baking, it should be pretty good. You know, it might be a good illusion. If it isn't, we can always change it later, but I'm just hedging my bets at the moment. In keeping with not using the points and faces tool, just to show you other tools, for this one, for the hinge, we're just going to use the strokes tool, which works really good on cylindrical objects. And this is where something I was saying earlier will come back, because with the points and faces tool, we could actually place points and it would ignore the ghosted object. But unfortunately the strokes tool still includes it. So when you draw your stroke, as you can see here, it does actually go right through the lid. And we could just select these strokes and remove them, but instead what I will do for this object, and what I'll probably do for some other objects later as well, is to just move it out of the layer temporarily so that we can just work on it on its own. And so making sure that I do have symmetry on here, the x-axis is all we need. I'm going to just start drawing my line down, but then I'll hold the shift key to make sure the line's straight, and I'm starting this first line outside of the object, so what you end up with is a like this orange line. And now I'm just adding in some other lines, again still holding the shift key and starting outside of the object, and these will basically just be like where the cylinder will extrude to. To actually create the cylinder itself, you want to start your line on the object, and I'm still using the shift key to keep it straight, but when you start a line on the object, it's a green line this time, and you want it to go beyond the extents of our furthermost left and right edges. And then you just set your segments, and then just press enter to apply. Now for the middle bit here, because we are using symmetry, if I were to just go ahead and create the points, let's say with the points and faces tool, you can see that it would actually snap down into the crevasse there, which obviously we don't want, because we might as well keep this shape straight, because we're just going to bake all of this stuff down with normal maps anyway. So instead, one little trick is to disable the symmetry temporarily and then just fill in the gaps with the points and faces tool, and then you can just use the collapse tool, and then if you hold control while hovering over an edge, it will just ring select that whole ring, and then you can just collapse it down, but make sure you turn off the auto snap. And there we are. Now it should still be symmetrical, but if you wanted to, you can enable symmetry and then just hit the symmetrical copy button just to make sure. And now here I am just going to hold the control key down with the points and faces tool and just add in another little edge loop and two here, because it just seems to be a little wonky. And then the standard thing of you select an edge, press the L key, and then hop into the transform tool, and you can just sort of move them around and then hit apply to extrude, and again just scale them, and then just fill in the rest with points and faces or quads if you want. And now I'm just going to put the hinge back into the lid layer. This is optional. Like if you want, you could just have every single piece as its own individual layer, but for me, I just prefer to kind of have things parented where I think it makes sense. It's mostly for organization reasons, but it will also play a part when it comes to the baking, and we have name correspondence, but again, we'll cover that a bit later. So yeah, I will put the hinge back into the lid, and I will get the handle, and I will actually take that out because we're just going to do the exact same thing with the strokes, and so I just prefer to have it isolated. And yeah, there's nothing much to talk about here because this is pretty much exactly the same as we just did with the hinge. For the front covers here, I will just use points and faces as usual, and yeah, just going to make a new layer. And as I said before, I'm not naming these layers because I will eventually merge them, so it doesn't matter if they have these default names, it's all good. One neat little thing you can do is just select the outermost faces and then just use the shell tool and then just put it roughly in place. Don't hit the apply button because that will actually perform an extrusion, so then you can keep kind of adding bits on. So just select any other tool just to come out of that tool and it will keep what you have. And then I just hop into the points and faces tool and just tidy it up a bit and it's all good. So now the lid portion of this is finished, I think. But I have just realized that there's a few areas of some geometry that we'll never actually see, so I'm just going to go through and make some face selections and then just remove them. And then lastly, I'm just going to hold the shift key while moving these layers on top of each other to merge them into the same one, culminating in them all becoming this one lid layer. For the front piece here, the lock, again I'm just going to move the pipes layer outside of it just to isolate it. And make sure you make a new retopo layer. And I'm just going to use the strokes again to create this geometry because it is pretty sweet for cylindrical geometry. And so once that's in place, I just use the select tool again, and I select an edge and press the L key just to grab the loop. And I'll just position the edges where I need to, and then on the other side I also use the apply button just to create an extra little lip, and then just fill it in with points and faces. Same stuff as before. And then lastly, I'm just going to select all of the faces, and I'm going to use the clone tool just to move it down. And when it asks me if I want to snap this mesh to the sculpt mesh, on this particular example, I just say no. There are instances where maybe you would want to, but I would rather just keep my geometry as I have made it. From here on out, it is mostly the same, you know, points and faces, selecting things, transform, scaling, moving. So I'm going to speed through quite a lot of what's happening here, and I'll probably just pick it up again if there's something that I do that's worth mentioning. Okay, yeah, so here's the thing. I was using symmetry on the X and Y just to create the shape because it was just much quicker to create it like that, because then you only have to create a quarter of it and it just builds the rest itself. But it did create a bunch of geometry that I don't actually need. And so after I was finished making the shape, I just turn off the symmetry and I just delete the edges that I don't need, which is a, you know, neat little tip. For these cog pieces, I'm going to do something slightly different. If you remember earlier when we were doing the strokes tool on the hinge and it was going through the ghosted lid object, I said before that we could have just selected those extra stroke loops and removed them, but instead, just for the sake of easiness, I decided to take the hinge out of the layer just to isolate it. So for this one, we can't move anything out of a layer because the cogs are all in the same layer. I mean, we could if we really wanted to, but there's no point. So I do use the strokes tool to just get the two outlines on one of these cylinders, and you can see that it did create a stroke that went through the top cylinder. And so all you have to do is holding down the shift key, you can actually just select the loops that you don't want and then remove them, and then just complete the stroke with the usual techniques. And then I'm just using the points and faces tool to fill in the gaps. And I am creating these as whole cylinders for now. Oh, and also, yeah, again, just selecting the faces and cloning those up into the top piece. And the reason I've done these as whole pieces is because they do animate a bit, from what I can tell, at least in the game. They do rotate ever so slightly, not a full rotation though, so I do remove some of the geometry that you see here. And now to finish off the lock area, we only have the chain left to go. And for this, it's going to be really, really simple. I'm just going to start with the points and faces tool just to create a quad. And then I'm going to scale it so that it's flat on one side and then move that around so that it's just sitting behind the chain. So essentially we're not actually making any, proper like 3D representation of this chain. If it's not entirely obvious yet, all we're going to do is basically bake this chain down into like a flat geometry, and then we'll just use alpha to cut it out. And so it's a very similar method that we've done before. We're just going to select the edges and then just hit that apply button on the transform tool and just keep moving them down and rotating them until the chain is completed. And that's about it. So now we're in the home stretch. It's only the flippy outy bits that are left, so make a new layer as per usual, and I'm just going to hide all of the others. To begin with, it's the points and faces as per usual, and for this particular shape, I'm still using the symmetry on both the X and the Z, so that will come in handy. And whilst I'm here, I might as well also give the same treatment to the extended pieces out on the left here, and of course there's one on the right, but I have symmetry, so that will be made anyway. It is worth mentioning that 3D Coat is still a little bit wonky when it comes to working with symmetry, especially more than one axis. So if you do see something like this, just hit that symmetrical copy button and hopefully it will fix the issue, or it will put the issue on both sides, in which case you just want to hit that invert mirror button that we did before. Once those are in place, we can actually just use the shell tool after selecting the faces, similar to what we did with the front plate cover things. So just extrude that down as much as you need to, and then just switch to a different tool to drop out. Remember that if you do hit apply here, it will basically create another set of faces because it thinks that you're trying to extrude, so definitely watch out for that. I will also make a new layer for these hinges, and I might as well drag them out of the main layer so that I can isolate them, because we're going to use the strokes tool again with these. And then it's just the standard practice of selecting the edges, moving them where you need to, and hit the apply if you want to make an extrusion. And then again for this straight piece we can just use the strokes, but we don't have to go edge to edge. In fact, it's recommended that you don't, because remember that we do need to put that green line in the middle here, and it has to go out of the bounds of our orange lines in order for the connection to be made. So make sure you give yourself some wiggle room here, and then after you've committed the shape you can just come in and select the edges and then just transform them to move them to where you want them to be. And now for this last piece, I'm just going to ghost the object above, and it's the points and faces tool again as per usual. You don't really need to ghost the object above this, but I thought I would do it just to be safe than sorry, because otherwise it might catch some of the points that I'm trying to make. It wouldn't be the end of the world, but And for here, I was having a hard time trying to connect up the last quad, so if you ever have this yourself, you can either switch to the quads tool, or you just create the quad somewhere else with the points and faces tool, and then just move the verts to where you want them to be. And then I am just going to select these top edges here and just move them up a bit. We don't actually need to create the geometry for the top faces, because it will always be hidden underneath the top piece, so just make sure it clips through just a tiny bit and then you should be good to go. And then very lastly for the legs, I'm just going to go with the strokes again, but this time I'm going to set the green line to be on one of the corners, and then I'll change the segments to 4. And this sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, but theoretically what it should do is just then create a 4-sided mesh that should wrap around each corner, and it's worked here, so that's good. And then same as before, I'm just going to grab the edges, but I have noticed that for some reason on this instance the strokes tool has created geometry on the the caps. I don't know what the requirements are for this because every other time that I've used the strokes tool in this tutorial it has not created the caps, but now it has, so there we go. So yeah, if you don't want the caps, remove them. Just select the edges and move them. And again, we don't need to create or keep any of the caps that we hear because we don't see any of this mesh at all. And there we are. That is the end of the retopology video. And oh my god, has it taken forever. What are we up to now, like half an hour? I feel sorry for all of you. I'll be back sometime shortly for the next video where we'll probably just do the unwrap and the bake, and then I'll leave texturing itself up to like one whole video, and then another video for just all of the in-game goodness with the animations and shaders, and probably some particle systems now that I think about it. So yeah, as usual, thank you very much for watching. I'd be surprised if any of you still are, to be fair. There might be like 8 of you. And so to all 8 of you, yeah, thank you very much. I will see you in the next one.